Candace Owens. She's a black conservative activist who, if you know anything about her, got signal boosted by Kanye and then got denounced by Kanye. She's not good. Candace is one of the many black conservatives out there that claims to be a free thinker, TM, because they don't vote for Democrats, don't believe racism is a problem outside of literal Klansmen because Obama, and say it's black culture to blame for their problems. However, Candace puts a bit of a spin on it, because she's a millennial, but also because she uses some legitimate and a lot of ridiculous criticisms of the Democrats to say the party is the new plantation for black folks. And that's why they vote blue, because welfare and stuff. Which is why they should ignore the entirety of the GOP's history with race since the 1960s and join up. She fell off the radar for a while after saying something weird about Hitler, being a nationalist, to defend Trump, then somehow testified before Congress because the GOP doesn't care. This is all to establish that, after months of not making headlines or getting much attention, Candace popped up again recently with a molten take on the police murder of George Floyd. The video, "I do not support George Floyd," Lord in heaven help me, is an 18-minute rant of her saying, quote, "It was horrible and he shouldn't have been murdered, but," and then proceeding to trash Floyd as the lowest of the low, not the best the black community can provide, a junkie, a thug, and reading out his arrest record. Absolutely none of this has to do with why people are talking about George Floyd, or why he has become a martyr for the black community. A police officer kneeled on his goddamn neck for 8 minutes and 46 frickin' seconds. It doesn't matter if he was high during the incident, or that he had a rap sheet, or that he wasn't some exemplary civil rights leader. He was a poor black man in America who was viciously murdered by a cop with 18 prior complaints on his record and a history of over-aggressive treatment towards black people. But of course, Candace doesn't really care about that because she's too busy reprimanding the black community for daring to demand justice for him. It's just disgusting, and I wouldn't recommend you watch the video unless you want a straight shot of classism and righteous indignation into your bloodstream. However, something did come out of my viewing of her trash video. Some of the things she was saying about George Floyd and poor working-class black folks like him. Yes, the infamous New York Times declaration of Michael Brown, another black man killed by the police, as, quote, "no angel," did come to mind. However, what came first to my mind was a story from much, much longer ago, which is eerily similar. This is that story. We begin in the year 1900. In the historically notorious district of New York City, running from 24th to 42nd Street and from 5th to 7th Avenue, known as the Tenderloin. Back in the day, the Tenderloin was New York's red light district, or vice district as they were called back then, filled with nightclubs, gambling casinos, brothels, dance halls, and pool halls, all of which regularly sparked the ire of 19th century social reformers. Additionally, the district was rife with racial and interracial tensions, with working-class Irish, German, and native-born residents at odds with, albeit heavily segregated, working-class and middle-class black folks, who in turn were at odds with the increasing number of Caribbean migrants to the district. On top of that, like a lot of vice districts, the Tenderloin was also crime-ridden, often labeled the most crime-ridden in the US at the time. You might be wondering why it's called the Tenderloin. Or not, either way I'm going to tell you. It comes from a comment NYPD Captain Alex Clubber Williams, charming man, made when asked by a friend in September 1876 about his recent transfer from a less flashy district to the one in question. He said, "I've been having chuck steak for a long time, and now I am going to eat tenderloin." You're probably still confused. Allow me to help. With the crime in the Tenderloin came rampant police corruption through bribes and graft. Clubber's comment meant that having been moved to the Tenderloin, he could get so many more bribes for protection from legitimate and illegitimate businesses, mostly brothels. And yes, his nickname is a reference to the 18 charges of assaulting citizens he wasn't convicted for. Also, yes, he was the model of all cops in the district. Plainclothes officers were a common practice in this area and many working-class districts, and these cops had near unlimited power to arrest whoever they wanted to for any reason. And a favorite target were immigrants and black folks, particularly black women, who could be arrested simply for walking around at night because the cops thought they were all prostitutes, because of course. Many officers acted like glorified street thugs, breaking into people's homes, arbitrarily grabbing them off the street, and clubbing people viciously. This is all to set up the events of the night of August 11th, 1900. It was one of the hottest days on record at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, along with being incredibly humid. And like most residents of the Tenderloin, May Enoch and Arthur Harris were on their stoops or heading to the saloons to try and escape the heat. No air conditioning back then. Enoch and Harris were a poor black common-law couple living in a tenement house at 241 West 41st Street, and both had only moved to the district 2 weeks prior. On this night, the pair had picked up food for the next day, but since it was too hot to make a fire, they changed their dinner plans and left to go to Dobbin's restaurant at 1 a.m. On the way, Harris stopped at McBride's saloon to get a cigar and a ginger ale, as he later stood by that he did not drink. He stayed for quite a while, with Enoch waiting on the outside until she got impatient with the delay and went in the saloon to retrieve him. At around 2 a.m., white, plainclothes cop Robert Thorpe on 41st and 8th noticed Enoch, a black woman, enter McBride's, converse with a black man, and exit to wait for him. Thorpe was notorious in the Tenderloin for standing on his corner to assault black men and women practically for fun, on and off duty. Of course, he thought Enoch was a prostitute soliciting a customer. Thorpe immediately grabbed her and tried to forcibly arrest her for solicitation. Just as Harris was walking out of McBride's, someone told him, "Someone got your woman." And Harris, not knowing Thorpe was a plainclothes officer, attempted to defend his partner. In response, Thorpe let go of Enoch, who ran home, and began clubbing Harris in the head for interfering. Trying to defend himself against this barrage, and again, not knowing Thorpe was a cop, stabbed him. Harris escaped the scene and fled to his mother's home in Washington, D.C., where he was eventually captured. Enoch was arrested the next day and imprisoned at the New York City House of Detention at a $500 bail. Thorpe was admitted to Roosevelt Hospital at 2:15 a.m., but died from post-operative shock at 8:45 a.m., age 26. As you might expect, as a beloved cop of white Tenderloin residents and fiancé of a police captain's daughter, Thorpe's murder by a recent black immigrant to the city enraged the whites of the Tenderloin. It was this incident that ignited a pivotal moment in the history of black New Yorkers and New York as a whole. At 11 p.m. on August 15th, near Thorpe's house during his wake, Spencer Walters, a black man, and Thomas Healy, a white man, came to blows and sparked the infamous New York race riot of 1900. A combination of white frustration over the growing black population in the Tenderloin and Thorpe's death led the white residents of the district to start attacking any black person on the street. The 4-hour ferocious riot, lasting until a torrential rainstorm dispersed the rioters at 3 a.m., saw any black man, woman, or child caught out after 8 o'clock between 29th and 43rd Street and 7th and 9th Avenue, or even those who were still in their homes, barely escaping death at the hands of the mob and the police. There was little safe haven for the black victims because, while some police officers tried to shelter black folks from the violence, many cops wholeheartedly participated in the riot. Many black citizens who sought protection from the police were quickly met with racist assaults from these very protectors. For example, a black woman disembarking from a streetcar was surrounded by a mob, but seeing a policeman, she ran to him, hoping he would help her get past them. But he instead turned away from her and said in his best Dirty Harry impression, "Go to hell, damn you." At the same time, William and Annie Hamer, two black musicians, were dragged from the streetcar and beaten with sticks and stones and struck Annie in the mouth with a brick. On top of this, those racist cops were arbitrarily dragging off bloodied, bruised, and often crippled black victims to police stations for no real reason. Even after the main riots were dispersed on the first night, the racial violence continued more sporadically until about August 17th, the day that a mob attempted to lynch a black man named Alexander Robinson from a lamppost on 34th and 8th. This is not Alabama. This is not Mississippi. This is not Georgia. This is New York City. And yes, the city was very different in 1900. But even back then, this was a turning point. The public reaction to this riot, the worst racial upheaval since the 1863 draft riots, often pointed to this as evidence of the North being, quote, southernized, due to the intensity of the riot and its similarity to Southern racial violence. It laid bare the incredible racial animosity of white citizens towards blacks that seemed to have only been growing worse. One Protestant minister lamented that, "We thought that race hatred had died in the great convulsion of the Civil War, but that race hatred has survived." He thought they had solved racism in 1900. Weird, kind of like now, but even more wrong. The supposed civilized image of race relations in NYC, in contrast to the white supremacist regime of the South, had been shattered. And it didn't help any that the leaders of the riots, after the fact, boldly declared their belief that the N-words here should be treated like down south. Most citizens reported that not only were the cops indifferent to black residents, but often participated alongside the white rioters, with some even saying the cops abused them more than the rioters. To add literal insult to injury, most of the poor black victims living on subsistent wages who had suffered from physical and psychological damage and had had valuables stolen by the police could hardly afford their medical bills and criminal fines, preventing them from working. Now, what does this exactly have to do with Candace Owens? Well, as I said before, points in her video on George Floyd sounded rather familiar to me, and specifically familiar to the reaction of the black community and community leaders to this event. Let's back up a bit. New York's black population, and the North's more generally, was fairly small at this time, with the Great Migration of Southern blacks only beginning in earnest around the 1910s. As a result, there were two rather distinct economic groups for black New Yorkers: middle-class and elite blacks mostly living in Brooklyn, and poor, mostly recent black immigrants in the Tenderloin. The attitude of black elites was, to put it mildly, extremely classist and verging on racist as well. Due to white supremacist images of all blacks as inferior and uncivilized, black leaders distinguished themselves from the working class and poor and stressed black people's adherence to appropriate white standards of behavior, particularly concerning the stereotypes of black manhood and womanhood. Many pushed the doctrine of racial uplift, that being the ideology of self-help, racial solidarity, temperance, thrift, charity, social purity, patriarchal authority, and the accumulation of wealth. In summary, black capitalism. you'll probably know one of its best-known promoters, Booker T. Washington. Of course, a key component of this ideology is for black elites to, quote, uplift the lower classes and enforce the politics of respectability. In a word, the black domestic version of the white man's burden. Acknowledging this, it was the classist racial uplift ideology which shaped the black community's response to the riot. With the Tenderloin's reputation as a neighborhood crawling with vice and sin, black activists took an unusual tact to seek justice. They drew a clear distinction between the hard-working, respectable blacks and the supposedly inferior, lawless, immoral blacks, and that the only ones attacked were the respectable ones. Frank Moss, a white attorney for several of the victims, stressed that the desolate Negroes who are so often seen lounging about the Tenderloin and its neighborhood are not to be found among my witnesses. Some went as far as to say the police had warned these desolate Negroes of the riot ahead of time so they could clear out. Seriously. To legitimize their claims, nearly all the statements of the victims attested to their moral character and their strong work ethic. No matter the circumstances of these people, normally condemned under the blanket of racial uplift, they maintained that they were peaceful, law-abiding citizens who worked hard for their living. Black women, in particular, wary of their public perception as immoral and indecent, made certain to emphasize their marital status, their commitment to their children, and many had older women reinforce their stories to give them more weight. That part is the best segue to a very specific statement by one black leader that really caught my eye. A response to the character of May Enoch and Arthur Harris. The leader in question was Reverend William H. Brooks, pastor of St. Mark's Methodist Episcopal Church and president of the Citizen Protection League. Reverend Brooks was an educated, well-off black man, and his church housed the largest and wealthiest congregation of any black church in New York City, meaning he, of course, subscribed to racial uplift. The Reverend gave a sermon addressing the riots shortly after they had subsided, making a point at the beginning of saying, "This is a conservative church, and its pastor is a conservative man." He proceeded to blame the Enoch Harris Thorpe incident on bad whiskey and bad women. He stressed the well-defined principle of 19th century black activism that black men must be protectors of women, combating the stereotype of the black male rapist and defining black masculinity. This approach was not so much an effort to develop an independent, masculine black identity, but to dismiss the emasculation of slavery through comparison to Anglo-Saxon men. Despite this seeming defense of Harris's actions, which nearly all accounts of the incident suggest were to protect Enoch from Thorpe, Reverend Brooks was silent about his motivations, even suggesting, despite his being a teetotaler, that Harris was a drunkard. Beyond this, oddly, he stressed that the protection of women must be tied to the legal system, and the fact that Harris's action had killed a cop, even if that cop thought his wife was a prostitute and had attacked her and Harris hadn't known he was a cop, making him criminal rather than honorable. But Brooks saved his worst takes for the victim, May Enoch. As he said before, Brooks did not challenge the notion that Enoch was a prostitute, which she was not. He wholeheartedly blamed her for acting out of turn and inviting Thorpe to believe she was soliciting, ignoring the common occurrence in the Tenderloin of cops harassing and arresting working-class black women for prostitution only because they spoke to a man or were walking down the street at night. Brooks, as a black community leader, certainly knew about this issue, but had no care to consider it in Enoch's case. In the eyes of black folks like Brooks, Enoch lost credibility as a poor, working-class black woman in a common-law marriage living in a neighborhood with a bad reputation, and was not worth being given the benefit of the doubt or courtesy that middle class and wealthy blacks would be given. This sentiment is what I recognized in Candace Owens' video. The idea that because George Floyd, yes, had a criminal record, was poor, and wasn't a model citizen, i.e., religious small business owner, pillar of the community to everyone, he isn't worth the reaction his murder sparked. But it goes deeper than that. There is the condemnation of black culture, insistence on conforming to the standards of white racists that believe blacks are all inferior, the fervent support for law enforcement and the rule of law, and stressing, above all, that the black community must consist of civil, respectable, and law-abiding citizens. This classist ideology, which once dominated the realm of black activism in America, discounts and marginalizes poor black folks as degenerate, uncivil, and inferior within their own community. I feel fairly certain that if presented with a description of racial uplift based on her video, Candace Owens would fully endorse it. Similarly to Reverend Brooks's dismissal of Mae Enoch as a bad woman and ignoring that she was not a prostitute, Candace pretends that the 7 years between George Floyd's parole and his death, in which, by all accounts, he made a concentrated effort to turn his life around, simply didn't happen. MLK said, after all, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, not injustice anywhere that we deem righteous is a threat to justice everywhere. I do not pretend to speak for the black community like Candace does, and why would I? I'm white. But I can pretty easily recognize when pandering to white supremacist capitalist standards of behavior and reality is being cloaked behind the supposed black activism. In the immortal words of the great Fred Hampton,
we don't think you fight fire with fire fists, we think you fight fire with water fists. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We said we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism.
If it needs saying, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, and keep fighting.